A Mustang colt locked in total darkness since he was just 2 weeks old. No sunlight, no open spaces, no freedom. Everyone said he'd never be rideable, but when the stable door finally opened and light touched his eyes, what he did shocked everyone. This isn't just a rescue. It's a journey of patience, healing, and a bond that will move you to tears. The old wooden barn hadn't been opened in over a month. Behind its weathered doors, hidden from the world, a young Mustang colt lay curled in the farthest corner of a windowless stall. He was barely 2 months old, but his body had already learned to fear every creak and vibration that passed through the walls. The space he lived in wasn't meant for horses or any living creature. Just 4 mouldy walls, straw scattered across concrete, and a rusty water trough that was refilled irregularly. That trough was his lifeline. No pasture, no herd, no mothers. Nurturing presence, and especially no light. He didn't even have a name. His ears flicked nervously at every sound that passed by. Most of the time, the footsteps continued without stopping, but when they did pause, it meant a handful of hay being tossed under the door and a quick splash of water in the trough. The humans who owned the property weren't intentionally cruel, just ignorant and overwhelmed. They had purchased the pregnant mare at auction without understanding what they were getting into, hoping to flip her for profit. When she gave birth, they were unprepared for the responsibilities of a foal. After the mare died from complications 2 weeks after giving birth, they simply placed the colt in the back barn until they figured out what to do with him. But days turned into weeks, and the colt stayed there, forgotten except for basic sustenance. Every day in the darkness, the young Mustang's heart raced faster at unfamiliar sounds. His muscles tensed, ready to flee though there was nowhere to go. His eyes, which should have been taking in the vast landscapes his ancestors roamed freely, saw nothing but blackness. The powerful instincts that wild Mustangs develop on the range, the awareness, the curiosity, the spirit, all began to turn inward and twist into fear. He wasn't learning to run alongside his mother. He was learning to survive abandonment. Then one morning, something changed. The sound was different, lighter, more deliberate, not the usual hurried footsteps, but someone moving with purpose. There was a pause, then the scrape of a rusty lock being turned. For the first time in over a month, the barn door creaked open, and the tiniest sliver of sunlight cut across the stall floor like a blade of fire. The colt didn't move. He pressed himself tighter against the corner, trembling uncontrollably. His eyes, unprepared for any light at all, squeezed shut against the painful brightness. His muscles bunched, ready to defend himself in the only way he knew how, with fear and flight. He let out a high-pitched whinny, weak and uncertain, but it was the only defense he could muster. Standing in the doorway was a woman with weathered skin and calm eyes. Her name was Elena Blackwood, a 47-year-old former rodeo rider-turned-equine rehabilitation specialist who had responded to an anonymous tip about abandoned horses. What she found was far worse than she'd expected. Not a neglected adult horse, but a Mustang colt, alone in darkness, his ribs visible through a dull coat, his legs trembling with weakness and terror. Elena dropped to a crouch, making herself smaller, less threatening. "Hey there, little one," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I see you. I see you." The colt didn't move. His eyes, now slightly open, darted wildly, searching for escape routes that didn't exist. The light hurt, making him toss his head in confusion and distress. Elena stayed perfectly still, just watching, assessing. She'd worked with abused and neglected horses for 15 years, but this, a foal raised in complete darkness, deprived of all normal equine experiences, this was something different altogether. "What have they done to you?" she murmured, more to herself than to the frightened animal. She could see that his development was all wrong. His legs, which should have been strong and sure by now, looked weak and slightly malformed from lack of exercise and proper nutrition. His coat had a strange, almost translucent quality from growing without sunlight. But it was his eyes that broke her heart, large, dilated, darting wildly, unable to process the light they were never given a chance to adjust to naturally. Elena didn't approach. Not yet. Instead, she slowly reached into the pocket of her worn leather jacket and pulled out a small handful of oats mixed with apple pieces. With deliberate care, she placed it on the ground halfway between them, then inched backward to give him space. "Your choice," she said softly. "Everything from now on is your choice." Minutes passed like hours. Neither moved. The colt's breathing gradually slowed as the initial shock of the light and the stranger faded into a wary stillness. His nostrils flared, catching the unfamiliar scent of fresh oats and apple. In his short, dark life, he'd only known hay, often stale and musty. This smell was different, enticing. Then something shifted. The colt took one hesitant step forward. His hoof touched the ground with such tentativeness it barely made a sound. Then another step. Each movement was a negotiation between paralyzing fear and desperate hunger. When he reached the small pile of food, he paused, nostrils working furiously, assessing for danger. Then, with a quick movement, he grabbed a mouthful and retreated instantly to his corner. Elena didn't move, didn't speak. She just watched, tears welling in her eyes, despite her years of professional detachment. When the colt finished that first mouthful, his attention turned back to where the food had been. She could see the internal struggle, fear versus need. "You're so brave," she whispered. "Braver than you know." Outside the barn, the morning sun climbed higher, sending more light through the open door. The colt blinked rapidly, his eyes watering from the unaccustomed brightness. But something was happening. His pupils were slowly beginning to contract, adjusting bit by bit. Elena recognized this as a crucial moment. If his eyes could adapt, it meant there was no permanent damage from the prolonged darkness. One small mercy in a situation that offered few. The colt made his decision. He ventured out again, step by cautious step, this time making it all the way to the remaining food. As he ate, his attention remained fixed on Elena, muscles tensed for immediate flight. But he didn't retreat immediately after finishing. Instead, he stood there just for a moment, uncertain what to do next in this new, illuminated world. Elena stayed crouched, completely still, making herself as unthreatening as possible. The Mustang was right there, close enough now that she could see the fine details of his face, the long eyelashes, the velvety muzzle, the whiskers that hadn't yet been trimmed. Despite everything, he was beautiful, a rich chestnut color with a small white blaze just beginning to show on his forehead. Then the colt did something unexpected. He took a single step toward Eleanor, not toward food, but toward her. One deliberate step closer to the first human who had shown him kindness rather than indifference. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was curiosity. And for an animal raised in darkness, curiosity was the first fragile bridge to a different future. Elena's breath caught. She knew better than to move, to break this tenuous moment. The colt's ears flicked forward, focusing on her completely for the first time. His nostrils flared again, taking in her scent. Leather, horses, the outdoors, life beyond four dark walls. "That's it," she breathed. "Just one step at a time." The standoff continued for nearly an hour. Elena remained crouched, occasionally, speaking in soft tones, while the colt alternated between retreating to his corner and venturing out for the small portions of food she placed on the ground, each one slightly closer to her than the last. By the time she placed the final handful just an arm's length away from herself, the barn had grown significantly brighter, as the sun reached its mid-morning position. The colt approached this closest pile with extreme caution, stretching his neck to its full length to avoid bringing his body too close to the human. As he ate, Elena slowly, so slowly it was barely perceptible, raised her hand, not touching him, just letting him become aware of her presence in a more direct way. The Mustang froze, food forgotten, staring at the outstretched hand with primal suspicion. His whole body trembled, but he didn't bolt. Not yet. Elena remained motionless, hands suspended in air, breathing calm and even. Their eyes met, human and hoarse, and something wordless passed between them. "You decide," Elena whispered, "everything at your pace." Seconds stretched into minutes. Then, with painful slowness, the colt extended his muzzle toward her hand. Not touching, just close enough to feel the warmth of her skin, to breathe in her scent more directly. His whiskers quivered inches from her fingertips. Elena had worked with hundreds of horses, from gentle pasture pets to severely traumatized rescues. But this moment, this breathless, almost connection with a creature who had known nothing but darkness and neglect, felt sacred in its fragility. The Mustang's courage faltered. He backed away suddenly, returning to his corner, but with less panic than before. Elena lowered her hand, acknowledging the boundary. She hadn't expected more. In fact, she'd achieved far more than she'd dared hope for in a first encounter. Slowly, she rose from her crouched position, keeping her movements deliberate and smooth. The colt watched her every move with intense focus. She backed toward the door, never turning away from him. "I'll be back tomorrow," she told him, "and the next day, and the day after that, for as long as it takes." As Eleanor stepped outside, she left the barn door partially open, not wide enough to seem threatening, but enough to let in a steady stream of light. The colt needed to begin, adjusting to daylight gradually, and this controlled exposure was the first step in what would be a long rehabilitation process. Walking back to her truck parked on the overgrown driveway, Elena pulled out her phone and made 2 calls. The first was to the local sheriff's department, reporting the neglect and abandonment. The second was to her partner at Whispering Winds Sanctuary, the small horse rescue they'd started together 5 years ago. "Morgan, we need to prepare the quiet stall," she said when he answered. "And call Dr. Levine. I found a Mustang colt, probably 3 months old at most, kept in complete darkness since shortly after birth. I've never seen anything like it." "How bad?" Morgan asked, his voice tight with the controlled anger he always felt toward those who mistreated animals. "Bad enough," Elena replied, looking back at the barn. "Malnutrition, possible developmental issues from confinement, extreme fear responses. But he's still in there, Morgan. I can see it in his eyes. That wild spirit hasn't been completely broken. What's the plan?" "I need to gain his trust enough to transport him. Then we'll begin from square one, teaching him how to be a horse when he's never seen one before." She paused. "It won't be quick, and it won't be easy." "Never is," Morgan replied simply. "I'll get everything ready." As Elena ended the call, her gaze remained fixed on the partially open barn door. The owners of the property were nowhere to be seen. They'd apparently left early that morning, according to a neighbor who had directed Elena to the back barn. The sheriff would handle them and the legal aspects of the neglect case. Her job now was focused entirely on that frightened colt, taking the first tentative steps toward trust. Elena returned to the barn entrance, settled herself on the ground just outside the door, and pulled out the small notebook she always carried. In it, she began documenting everything: the colt's physical condition, his behaviors, his responses. This detailed record would help track his progress and inform his treatment plan. As she wrote, she occasionally glanced up to find the colt, watching her from his corner, those large eyes now able to stay open in the partial light. "You need a name," she said softly. "Not just the colt or that poor thing." She thought for a moment, considering and rejecting several possibilities. Then it came to her simple and fitting. Ember, she decided, because even in the darkest places a single ember can keep the light alive. Ember, because despite everything there was still fire in those eyes. A small, frightened flame. But it was there. Elena had seen enough extinguished spirits to recognize the difference. This young Mustang still had something burning inside him, something that had survived a beginning that should have destroyed it. She continued her quiet vigil outside the barn door, occasionally speaking in low tones, letting Ember grow accustomed to her voice, her presence, the concept that humans could bring something other than darkness and neglect. As the hours passed, she saw tiny shifts in his behavior. His head held a fraction higher, his eyes blinking less frantically in the light, moments where curiosity briefly overtook fear. By late afternoon, Elena had established the beginnings of a routine, placing small amounts of food at progressive distances from his corner, never pushing, always allowing him to retreat when he needed to. With each appearance of food, she added a soft whistle, the same note each time, the first step in teaching him that sounds could predict good things rather than threats. When the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Eleanor knew it was time to leave. Ember needed rest, time to process the monumental changes this day had brought. She would return at dawn tomorrow to continue the patient work of building trust. "Rest well, Ember," she said, rising slowly to her feet. "Tomorrow is another day, another step." She closed the barn door partway, leaving the same opening as before. Enough light to prevent total darkness, but not so much as to overwhelm his sensitive eyes during the night. As she drove away from the property, Eleanor's mind was already mapping out the weeks ahead, the careful progression from barn to trailer, trailer to sanctuary, the specialized care Ember would need to overcome his traumatic start in life. It would be a long road, with no guarantees of success. But one thing she knew with certainty, the moment that Colt had taken that single step toward her, not for food, but out of the first fragile tendril of curiosity, had changed everything. In that step lay the possibility of healing, of transformation. It was a beginning, nothing more. Yet beginnings, Elena had learned through years of rehabilitation work, were the most crucial part of any journey, and Ember's journey was only just beginning. Because just when Elena thinks she's making progress, with the traumatized Mustang, an unexpected storm will trigger fears so deep that she'll question whether some damage runs too deep to heal. Elena arrived at dawn the next morning, her truck loaded with supplies, fresh hay, specialized feed formulated, for malnourished foals, soft brushes, and a lightweight halter that would be introduced only when Ember was ready. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of approaching rain. She glanced at the gathering clouds with concern. A storm would complicate today's work. Before opening the barn door, she stood quietly outside, listening. At first, she heard nothing. Then came a soft, tentative nickering, a sound she hadn't heard from Ember yesterday. It wasn't directed at her. He couldn't possibly know she was there. It was simply the first vocalization of a young horse beginning to find his voice. "Good morning, Ember," she called softly before touching the door, giving him warning of her presence. Then she eased the door open exactly as she'd left it the previous evening, maintaining consistency in his newly expanding world. The change was subtle but immediate. Unlike yesterday, Ember was standing rather than huddled in his corner. His head was up, ears forward with cautious interest rather than flattened in terror. The partial light from the doorway no longer seemed to cause him physical pain. His eyes, though still wary, tracked her movements with greater focus. "You've been thinking about things, haven't you?" Elena said, keeping her voice low and melodic. She settled into the same position as yesterday, just inside the doorway, giving him ample space. From her bag, she pulled out fresh oats and apple pieces, placing a small portion on the ground between them. This time, Ember approached with less hesitation. His steps were still careful, but the paralyzing fear had diminished overnight. He ate while keeping his eyes on Elena, then surprised her by remaining in place rather than retreating to his corner. His nostrils flared, taking in her scent more deliberately than before. Elena slowly reached into her pocket and produced a carrot, holding it flat on her palm. "Your choice," she reminded him, extending her arm halfway. Ember's ears flicked forward, his interest visibly piqued by this new offering. He stretched his neck, took a tentative step forward, then another. When he reached her hand, he paused, his breath warm against her palm. Then, with delicate precision, he took the carrot, his lips brushing against her skin for the briefest moment. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was progress. The contact, however minimal, was voluntary. Elena remained motionless, allowing Ember to retreat a few steps to eat his prize. As he chewed, she noticed his coat in the improved light, dull and rough where it should be sleek, but the rich chestnut color was beautiful nonetheless. His conformation, despite the developmental issues from confinement, showed his Mustang heritage, the compact strength, the intelligent eyes, the natural athleticism waiting to be unlocked. "Today, we're going to let in a little more light," Elena told him, rising slowly to her feet. Ember stiffened but didn't flee as she moved carefully toward the barn door. With deliberate slowness, she opened it another foot wider. Sunlight spilled across more of the stall floor, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Ember blinked rapidly against the increased brightness, but stood his ground. Elena returned to her spot, sitting cross-legged on the floor, making herself small and unthreatening. "Good boy," she said softly. "So brave." Over the next 3 hours, they established a quiet routine. Elena offered food, Ember approached, each time coming a little closer, staying a little longer. She introduced gentle words of praise with each approach, beginning the process of associating human speech with positive experiences. When he allowed her to raise her hand near his face without flinching, she considered it a major victory. By midday, the first distant rumble of thunder sounded. Ember's reaction was immediate. His head shot up, eyes wide, muscles tensing. He retreated to his corner, but not with the blind panic Elena might have expected. Instead, he watched the door, warily, as if assessing this new threat. "Just thunder," Elena explained calmly, though she knew the concept meant nothing to him. "It can't hurt you." As the storm drew closer, Elena faced a decision. Leaving Ember alone during what might be his first conscious experience of thunder could undo their progress. Staying might associate her presence with the frightening noise. After a moment's consideration, she chose to stay, moving to sit with her back against the wall nearest his corner, close enough to be a presence, but not so close as to make him feel trapped. The storm broke with sudden intensity. Rain hammered the old barn roof. Wind whistled through cracks in the weathered wood, and thunder boomed overhead. Ember trembled violently, his eyes rolling to show the whites. His breathing came in sharp, panicked bursts. Elena began to speak, not moving toward him, just providing a steady stream of calm words. "The world is bigger than this barn, Ember. Sometimes it's loud, sometimes it's quiet, but you're safe here. The rain can't reach you, the thunder can't touch you." As a particularly loud crack shook the barn, Ember did something unexpected. Instead of pressing deeper into his corner, he took a hesitant step toward Elena. Then another. When he reached her, he stood trembling, his muzzle inches from her shoulder. Elena remained absolutely still, barely breathing. This was Ember's choice, seeking comfort from a human when frightened, rather than retreating from one. It was a crucial shift in his perception, a fragile new connection forming in his young mind. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." For nearly 20 minutes they remained like this, the terrified colt standing beside the patient woman, both listening to the storm rage outside. Gradually, as the thunder became more distant, Ember's trembling subsided. When the storm finally passed, leaving only the gentle patter of diminishing rain, he took a few steps away, but not back to his corner. Instead, he remained in the center of the stall, his posture more relaxed than Eleanor had yet seen. Eleanor recognized the significance of what had just happened. Ember had faced something frightening and survived it. More importantly, he had sought in comfort rather than retreating into isolation. It was a pivotal moment in his rehabilitation. "You did it," she told him softly. "The first of many storms you'll weather in your life, but never alone again. I promise you that." As afternoon faded toward evening, Elena introduced something new, a soft brush. She placed it on the ground, allowing Ember to investigate it at his own pace. His curiosity overcame his caution, and he sniffed it thoroughly before stepping back. When Elena picked it up and held it out, he regarded it warily but didn't flee. "This is how we start taking care of you," she explained, slowly extending the brush toward his shoulder. Ember flinched when it first touched his coat, but then stood surprisingly still, as if recognizing that the gentle pressure actually felt good against his skin. Elena kept the first grooming session brief, just a few strokes along his neck and shoulder, nowhere near his head or legs, which would be too threatening at this stage. But it was enough to establish another positive association, another step toward normal horse care. As the light began to fade, Elena prepared to leave. She'd accomplished more than she'd hoped for today. Ember had accepted food directly from her hand, allowed the first minimal grooming, and most significantly, had sought her presence during a frightening experience. "Tomorrow, we'll try something bigger," she told him, gathering her supplies. "If you're ready, we'll see about introducing you to the outside world. Just a few steps, just for a few minutes." Before leaving, she made sure his water trough was filled and scattered fresh hay across the stall floor. She left the barn door open wider than the previous night, continuing the gradual process of acclimating him to natural light and the rhythms of day and night that had been denied him for so long. On the drive back to Whispering Wind's sanctuary, Elena called Morgan to update him on Ember's progress. "It's going better than I expected," she admitted. "He's responding more quickly than I thought possible." "Mustangs are resilient," Morgan replied. "Wild blood remembers more than we give it credit for. I'm thinking about trying to move him tomorrow if he's ready." "That's soon," Morgan sounded surprised. "What's the rush?" Elena sighed. "The property owners are being charged with animal neglect, but their family is making noise about coming to check on things. I don't want any complications. Need me to come help?" "Not yet. Having another person might be too much for him, but have the trailer ready just in case." "Always," Morgan assured her. After a pause, he added, "Be careful, Elena. Don't let attachment cloud your judgment. Quick. Progress sometimes masks deeper issues." "I know," she said softly, "but there's something special about this one, Morgan. I can feel it." After ending the call, Elena drove in thoughtful silence. Morgan's caution was well-founded. She'd seen it before, rescued animals appearing to adapt quickly, only to regress dramatically when faced with new stressors. But she'd also learned to trust her instincts, honed by years of rehabilitation work. And something told her that beneath Ember's fear lay an exceptional spirit waiting to emerge. The next morning arrived clear and cool, perfect weather for what Elena had planned. She arrived at the barn just as the first light crested the eastern hills, illuminating the neglected property in a golden glow that belied its sad history. This time, Ember nickered as soon as he heard her voice outside the door, a small greeting that made Elena smile. When she entered, she found him standing in the center of the stall, head up, ears forward, clearly anticipating her arrival. The change from just 2 days ago was remarkable. "Good morning, handsome," she said warmly, setting down her supplies. Today, she'd brought a light rope halter, soft and minimally restrictive, but she kept it hidden in her bag for now. First came the established routine. Food offered by hand, gentle words of praise, the soft brush stroked carefully across his shoulders and back. Ember accepted these attentions with growing ease, his initial tension dissolving more quickly each time. When Eleanor reached up to stroke his neck with her bare hand, he tensed momentarily, but then relaxed, allowing the touch. "Today's a big day," she told him softly. "Today, we step outside, just for a moment." She moved toward the barn door and pushed it fully open for the first time. Sunlight flooded the stall, along with fresh air carrying 1,000 new scents: grass, earth, distant water, other animals. Ember's nostrils flared, taking in this olfactory explosion with visible interest. Elena stepped outside, then turned to face him, standing just beyond the threshold. She held out her hand, a few oats resting on her palm. "Your choice," she said, as always. Ember stood frozen in the center of the stall, looking at the open door with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The world beyond was overwhelming, too bright, too open, too unknown. But Elena was there, a now familiar presence in an unfamiliar landscape. The internal struggle was visible, his feet shifting restlessly, his ears flicking back and forth, his eyes darting between Elena and the safety of his dark corner. Elena remained patient, hand extended, giving him all the time he needed. Finally, Ember took a hesitant step forward, then another. He approached the doorway and paused, one hoof raised as if testing an invisible barrier, the threshold between. His known world of darkness and the vast unknown beyond seemed insurmountable. "You can do it," Elena encouraged quietly. "One more step." Ember lowered his hoof, touching the ground outside the barn for the first time in his young life. He froze again, processing this new sensation, earth instead of concrete, yielding rather than unyielding. His head lowered to sniff this strange surface, ears swiveling to catch every new sound. Then, with surprising decisiveness, he took another step fully outside. The morning sunlight bathed his dull coat, transforming the chestnut color to a rich copper. He blinked against the brightness, but didn't retreat. Elena remained motionless, letting him experience this moment without interference. She watched as he lifted his head, nostrils flaring to catch the breeze, ears pivoting to track distant sounds, birds calling, leaves rustling, all the ordinary music of a world he'd been denied. It was a moment of pure discovery, a rebirth of sorts. In his tense but curious posture, Elena could see glimpses of his true nature beginning to emerge. The alertness, the sensitivity, the innate intelligence of his Mustang heritage. "Welcome to the world," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Ember turned toward her voice, took the offered food from her hand, then did something that took her breath away. He stretched his neck forward and gently, tentatively, rested his muzzle against her shoulder, not seeking food, but contact, connection. The touch lasted only seconds before he stepped back, seemingly surprised by his own boldness. But those seconds changed everything. In that brief, voluntary connection lay the foundation of trust. Fragile, still, easily broken, but undeniably present. Elena knew better than to push for more. This first venture outside had already exceeded her expectations. Gradually, over the next hour, she encouraged Ember to explore a small area around the barn door, never forcing, always allowing him to retreat inside when the outside world became too overwhelming. Each time he chose to step back out was another small victory. By mid-morning, Elena decided it was time to attempt the next critical step. From her bag, she withdrew the soft rope halter, holding it low where Ember could see and smell it. His reaction was immediate, ears back, head up, body tense with suspicion of this unfamiliar object. "It's okay," she soothed, not moving toward him. "This isn't to trap you. It's to keep you safe when we leave this place." She placed the halter on the ground between them, adding a few oats beside it, allowing Ember to investigate at his own pace. He approached cautiously, sniffed the rope, then ate the oats while keeping a wary eye on the strange object. Elena picked up the halter, holding it loosely in one hand while stroking Ember's neck with the other. Gradually, she brought the halter closer, letting it brush against his shoulder, then his neck, all while speaking in that same calm, reassuring voice that had become his anchor in a changing world. The process took nearly an hour, a delicate dance of advance and retreat, pressure and release. When Ember finally allowed the noseband to touch his face without flinching, Elena nearly wept with pride at his courage. "Just a little more," she encouraged, as she carefully slipped the halter over his ears, adjusting it to fit comfortably without being restrictive. Ember stood surprisingly still, trembling slightly, but accepting this new sensation with remarkable composure. Elena attached a light lead rope, but didn't apply any pressure. "There," she said softly, "you've done the impossible today. Tomorrow we go home." As she prepared to leave that evening, Elena felt a growing sense of urgency. The sheriff had called during her lunch break, warning that the property owner's relatives were becoming difficult, demanding access to collect personal items. The legal process would keep them at bay for a few days, but not indefinitely. Ember needed to be moved to the sanctuary as soon as possible, tomorrow, if he would accept the trailer without excessive trauma. It was sooner than ideal, but the alternative, risking interference from people who might have legal claims, was worse. "One more night here," she told Ember as she left the barn door partially open and filled his water one last time. "Tomorrow, everything changes." That night at the sanctuary, Elena and Morgan prepared the special stall they reserved for their most traumatized rescues, partially enclosed for security, but with a Dutch door opening onto a small private paddock, allowing choice and freedom. Within safe boundaries, they added extra bedding, installed a diffuser with calming pheromones, and made sure the environment was as quiet and stress-free as possible. "The trailer's ready," Morgan confirmed, "padded extra tall for a young Mustang. I'll drive separately so we can move at whatever pace he needs." Elena nodded gratefully. "He's made incredible progress, but tomorrow we'll test everything we've built. Trailers are terrifying, even for well-adjusted horses. If anyone can get him loaded safely, it's you," Morgan said with quiet confidence. "Just remember—" "I know," Elena interrupted with a tired smile. "Patience over pressure, even when time is short." As she fell asleep that night, Elena's thoughts remained with the young Mustang who'd spent his first months in darkness, but who might, just might, be ready to step into the light. But morning would bring challenges she couldn't anticipate, testing both Ember's fragile trust and her own resolve in ways that would define their journey together. The morning of the transport dawned with a sky heavy with clouds. Not storm clouds, like yesterday, but a thick blanket of grey that diffused the sunlight into a gentle glow. Elena took it as a good sign. The softer light would be easier on Ember's still sensitive eyes during his first real journey into the open world. She arrived at the property earlier than usual, her stomach tight with apprehension. Morgan followed in a separate vehicle, pulling the smallest, most open stock trailer, specially prepared with extra padding, fresh bedding, and a loading ramp with solid sides to minimize visual distractions. He parked at the end of the long driveway, out of sight from the barn, ready to assist but keeping his distance until called. Elena approached the barn alone, carrying only Ember's halter and a small pouch of special treats, honey-soaked oats, mixed with apple pieces, reserved for the most challenging training moments. Before entering, she took a moment to center herself, to push away the urgency she felt. Horses, especially traumatized ones, read human emotions with uncanny accuracy. Any anxiety she projected would transfer directly to Ember. "Good morning," she called softly, easing the door open. "Ready for a big day?" Ember stood in the center of the stall, head up, ears pricked forward at the sound of her voice. He nickered, a stronger, more confident sound than yesterday's tentative greeting. When she entered, he took a few steps toward her, no longer requiring food as incentive for approach. "Look at you," Elena murmured, smiling despite her nerves. "Making all the first moves now?" She began with their established routine. Gentle words, careful movements, a few treats offered from an open palm. Ember accepted these with growing confidence, his body language more relaxed with each interaction. When she brought out the halter, he lowered his head slightly, not exactly welcoming the equipment, but acknowledging its inevitability. "Good boy," she praised, as she carefully fastened the halter, keeping the lead rope loose in her hand. "We're going on a journey today." Elena's plan was deliberately simple. Minimize complications, break everything into small, manageable steps, and above all, give Ember choices whenever possible. First step, walking with the halter and led inside the familiar barn, she applied. The gentlest pressure releasing instantly when Ember took even a single step forward. His initial resistance was minimal, which surprised her. Though he'd never been formally halter-trained, his intelligence allowed him to quickly connect the pressure release pattern with the desired response. Within 15 minutes, he was following her in small circles around the stall, maintaining a respectful distance, but no longer balking at the guidance of the rope. "Perfect," Eleanor said softly. "Now for the tricky part." She led Ember to the barn door, which stood fully open now, the grey daylight spilling across the threshold. Yesterday he had ventured outside briefly on his own initiative, but today would be different, following human guidance into unknown territory. At the doorway he hesitated, muscles tensing. Elena didn't pull or urge. She simply waited, standing just outside, the lead rope loose between them. After a full minute of internal deliberation, visible in his shifting weight and flicking ears, Ember took a decisive step forward, crossing the threshold to stand beside her in the open air. "Brave boy," she whispered, offering a special treat from her pouch. The real test came next. Elena needed to lead Ember approximately 50 yards from the barn to where the trailer waited. For a horse who had spent his life in darkness and confinement, this distance might as well be miles. Each step would take him farther from the only security he'd known through a world of overwhelming sensations. She started with just a few steps away from the barn door, then paused, allowing him to process. His head was high, nostrils flared, to capture every scent, ears swiveling to track each new sound. When he seemed settled, she asked for a few more steps, maintaining this pattern of request, compliance, rest, and reward. Their progress was slow but steady. Halfway to their destination, Elena gave Ember a longer break, simply standing with him as he took in his expanded world. A pair of birds darted overhead, causing him to startle slightly, but he recovered quickly, looking to Elena for reassurance. Rather than attempting to flee, "Just some birds," she told him calmly. "Nothing to worry about." When they finally rounded the bend in the driveway and the trailer came into view, Elena felt Ember's immediate tension. He stopped abruptly, head up, eyes fixed on the unfamiliar object. Morgan, who had been waiting patiently beside his truck, remained perfectly still, understanding that his presence was another new variable for the young Mustang to process. "It's okay," Elena soothed, stroking Ember's neck. "That's just our ride, and that's just Morgan. He's a friend." She signaled Morgan to slowly approach, making no sudden movements. Morgan had worked with traumatized horses as long as Elena had. He knew exactly how to present himself as unthreatening, shoulders relaxed, gaze soft, movements fluid rather than jerky. "He's looking better than you described," Morgan commented quietly as he drew near, keeping his voice low and gentle. "He's come so far so quickly," Elena agreed, still stroking Ember's neck as the colt regarded Morgan with wary curiosity. "Ember, this is Morgan. He helps horses like you find their way home." Morgan didn't attempt to touch Ember. Instead, he simply stood nearby, allowing the young horse to observe him, to recognize that this new human moved and spoke with the same calm deliberateness as Elena. After a minute of assessment, Ember's posture relaxed slightly, though he remained vigilant. "Let's give him a look at the trailer before we try anything else," Morgan suggested. "No pressure, just familiarity." Together they led Ember in a wide arc that brought him within viewing distance of the trailer, but without any expectation of approach. The low ramp was down, the interior visible, bedded with fresh straw. They simply stood, letting him look, smell and listen to this new object that would soon become his temporary containment. "I've got apples," Morgan said after a few minutes, pulling a sliced piece from his pocket. He placed it on his flat palm, offering it to Elena rather than directly to Ember, another careful choice to avoid overwhelming the colt with too much. New interaction at once. Elena took the apple and held it out to Ember, who accepted it readily, his earlier caution around Morgan diminishing slightly at the prospect of this special treat. While he ate, Elena and Morgan exchanged glances, silently acknowledging that the next step would be the most challenging. "Ready to try?" Morgan asked. Elena nodded. "Slow and steady. If he shows any signs of panic, we back off immediately." They approached the trailer gradually, stopping every few feet to allow Ember to adjust. When they reached the foot of the ramp, Elena felt his resistance increase, subtle at first, just a slight backward shift of weight, then more pronounced as the reality of the enclosed space registered in his awareness. "It's okay," she assured. Him, not pulling, simply maintaining gentle contact through the lead rope. "Nothing bad will happen in there, I promise." Morgan moved to position himself behind and slightly to the side of Ember, not crowding, but creating a gentle barrier that made forward seem like the more natural option. From his pocket, he produced another apple slice, placing it on the ramp about halfway up. Ember noticed immediately, his focus shifting from the intimidating trailer to the tempting treat. He stretched his neck, trying to reach it without moving. His feet, but it was strategically placed just beyond reach. "Your choice," Elena reminded him, using the phrase that had become their shared understanding of agency and trust. For several long moments, Ember remained frozen in indecision. Then, with a deliberate step, he placed one hoof on the ramp, testing its solidity. Finding it secure, he took another step, reaching the apple and consuming it quickly. Morgan immediately placed another piece a few steps higher, closer to the trailer's entrance. Step by careful step, treat by strategic treat, they guided Ember up the ramp and to the threshold of the trailer. Here he balked again, more decisively. The interior, though well lit by design, was still an enclosed space, triggering memories of his dark confinement. Elena didn't push. She stepped into the trailer herself, moving to the far end and turning. To face him. "See? It's safe. I'm right here." Morgan remained outside, giving Ember space to make his final decision without feeling trapped. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then, with a soft exhale that seemed almost like resignation, Ember stepped fully into the trailer, moving immediately to Elena's side as if seeking reassurance that he wasn't alone in this frightening new container. "You did it," she whispered, running her hand along his neck in long, soothing strokes. "You incredible brave boy." Morgan secured the trailer with practiced efficiency, leaving the top doors open for light and air. I'll drive at a walk, he assured. Elena, the sanctuary's only 4 miles from here. We'll take it slow and steady. Elena nodded gratefully. She would ride in the trailer with Ember for this first journey, an unusual practice, but one she felt necessary given his unique history and fragile trust. As Morgan's truck pulled forward, Ember's panic flared briefly, wide eyes, tensed muscles, a shrill whinny of distress. Elena pressed her body gently against his shoulder, speaking continuously in that same calm voice that had become his touchstone. The ground is moving, I know. It's strange, I know. But you're safe. I'm right here. Gradually, impossibly, he settled. Not completely relaxed, that would be too much to expect, but contained, coping, finding balance in the swaying trailer through small adjustments of weight and position. His focus remained fixed on Eleanor, as if she were the only stable element in his suddenly mobile world. The journey to Whispering Wind's sanctuary took nearly 40 minutes at the slow pace Morgan maintained, careful to avoid sudden stops or sharp turns. When they finally rolled through the sanctuary's gates, Elena felt a wave of relief so intense. It nearly brought tears to her eyes. They had made it, the first critical transition, complete without trauma or setback. Morgan parked the trailer beside the special stall they had prepared, positioning the ramp directly in line with the wide doorway. The layout allowed Ember to move from trailer to stall without feeling exposed in open space. Another deliberate choice to ease his transition. Home, sweet home, Elena told Ember, as Morgan carefully opened the trailer. A real home this time. The unloading went more smoothly than either of them had dared hope. Ember followed Elena without hesitation, seemingly more concerned with maintaining their connection than with assessing his new surroundings. Only when he was safely inside the stall did he begin to explore. First, through scent, nostrils flared, to capture the unfamiliar odors of fresh bedding, quality hay, and the distant presence of other horses. Then through cautious movement around the spacious enclosure. The stall was specially designed for rehabilitation cases, twice the standard size, with solid walls 3/4 of the way up, then bars that allowed visual contact with the outside world without overwhelming exposure. A Dutch door opened onto a small private paddock, secured now, but ready to offer expanded freedom when Ember was prepared for it. Elena removed his halter, allowing him complete freedom within this safe space. "What do you think?" she asked softly, watching as he investigated each corner, each feature of his new residence. His response surprised her. After completing a circuit of the stall, he returned to where she stood and lowered his head, pressing his forehead briefly against her chest in a gesture that seemed almost like gratitude. It lasted only a moment before he moved away again, but the voluntary contact sent a clear message. He had connected her presence with safety. Morgan, observing from outside the stall, shook his head in amazement. "I've never seen a horse with his background adapt so quickly," he admitted. "You've done miracle work with him, Elena." "It's not me," she replied, watching as Ember discovered the water bucket, drinking deeply from the clean, fresh supply. "It's him. There's something special there, something that darkness couldn't extinguish." Over the next few hours, they established Ember's new routine. Fresh hay in the corner feeder, specialized feed in a bucket hung at the proper height for his size, water kept clean and abundant. The veterinarian was scheduled to visit the following morning for a complete assessment, blood work, and the beginning of his vaccination protocol. As evening approached, Eleanor prepared to leave Ember alone in his new environment, a necessary separation, though it pained her to think of him facing his first night in strange surroundings without her reassuring presence. "I'll be back first thing tomorrow," she promised him, stroking his forehead one last time. "And every day after that. You're home now, Ember, really home." She was halfway to the barn door when she heard it, a soft, plaintive nickering that stopped her in her tracks. Turning back, she found Ember watching her intently, ears forward, expression alert, but not frightened. When their eyes met, he nickered again, a clear communication. "I see you leaving. I acknowledge it, but I'll be." "Okay," Elena smiled, blinking back unexpected tears. "Good night, brave one," she said softly. "Dream of open skies." That night, driving home to her small cabin on the sanctuary property, Elena felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that the rescue and transport had gone so well, concern for the long rehabilitation still ahead, and a growing personal attachment that both warmed and worried her. Professional distance was important in her work, but something about Ember had bypassed her usual careful boundaries. Morgan noticed her distraction as they shared a simple dinner on her porch, going over the day's events and planning the next steps in Ember's care. "You're getting attached," he observed mildly, no judgment in his tone. Elena sighed, not bothering to deny it. "He's special, Morgan, not just another case." "They're all special," he reminded her gently. "That's why we do this work." "This is different," she insisted. "The way he responds, the way he connects. It's like he's been waiting his whole life to trust someone." Morgan studied her thoughtfully. "Just be careful. His journey is just beginning and there will be setbacks. Hard ones." "I know," Elena acknowledged, "but I also know potential when I see it. Given time and the right care, he could be exceptional." Morgan didn't argue further, but his expression remained concerned. He'd seen many rescuers, even experienced ones like Eleanor, project their hopes onto damaged animals, creating expectations that reality couldn't always fulfill. Attachment was a double-edged sword in rehabilitation work. It provided motivation and dedication, but it could also cloud judgment. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. Her mind kept returning to Ember, wondering how he was coping with his first night in the new stall, whether the strange sounds and scents of the sanctuary were frightening or intriguing to him. Finally, at nearly midnight, she gave up and pulled on her boots. The sanctuary was peaceful under a sky scattered with stars, the air cool and sweet with the scent of grass and distant pine. Elena walked quietly to the rehabilitation barn, a small flashlight guiding her path. As she approached Ember's stall, she moved with deliberate slowness, not wanting to startle him with a sudden appearance. The sight that greeted her was unexpected and heartening. Ember was lying down in the fresh bedding, not huddled in fear as he had been in the dark barn, but stretched out in the relaxed posture of genuine rest. His eyes were closed, his breathing deep and even. Elena didn't enter or disturb him. She simply stood watching for a few minutes, taking in the powerful image of this young horse, who had known nothing but darkness and confinement, now sleeping peacefully in a safe place. It wasn't the end of his journey, far from it, but it was a beginning full of promise. As she turned to leave, Ember's eyes opened. He lifted his head slightly, regarding her with calm recognition, then lowered it again without alarm or distress. He had acknowledged her presence and deemed it unthreatening, normal, even welcome. Walking back to her cabin under the vast starlit sky, Elena felt a renewed sense of purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: the veterinarian's visit, the beginning of proper medical assessment and care, the slow introduction to the routines and boundaries of his new life. But tonight had shown her that Ember possessed not just the capacity for trust, but the resilience to adapt to positive change. What she couldn't know, as she finally drifted to sleep in the early hours of the morning, was that the greatest challenge to Ember's recovery was still to come. Because sometimes healing isn't a straight path forward. Sometimes it requires confronting the very darkness from which you were rescued, facing the people who failed you before you can truly step into the light. And in just 3 days' time, the past Ember had escaped would arrive at the sanctuary gates, bringing with it complications that would test everything he had learned about trust, and everything Elena believed about her ability to protect him. The veterinarian arrived promptly at 9 the next morning. Dr. Lillian Reeves was a specialist in equine rehabilitation, with particular expertise in rescued horses suffering from neglect and abuse. Her reputation in the region was unmatched, her services in constant demand, but she always made time for Whispering Winds Sanctuary. She understood the critical importance of proper medical assessment for newly rescued animals. Elena met her at the main gate, a mixture of anticipation and anxiety tightening her chest. Dr. Reeves's evaluation would provide the first comprehensive understanding of Ember's physical condition and the challenges that lay ahead in his rehabilitation. "He's in the isolation barn?" Dr. Reeves asked, as she gathered her equipment from her truck. Elena nodded. "Stall 3. He's been here less than 24 hours, but he's adjusting remarkably well. Let's not get ahead of ourselves," the veterinarian cautioned, her expression kind but tempered by experience. "First impressions can be deceiving with trauma cases. Let's see what we're really dealing with." They walked together toward the rehabilitation barn, Dr. Reeves listening attentively as Elena detailed Ember's rescue, his conditions of confinement, and his surprising progress over the past 3 days. The vet's expression grew increasingly concerned as she absorbed the details of the young Mustang's early life. "Deprived of light during critical developmental stages," she murmured, shaking her head. "There could be lasting neurological effects. We can't even predict yet." At the barn entrance, Elena paused. "Should I go in first to reassure him?" Dr. Reeves considered this. "Yes, but don't make it a big production. We want him to learn that new people aren't always cause for alarm. I'll follow a minute later." Elena entered the barn with her usual quiet greeting. "Morning, Ember. We have a visitor today." The young Mustang was standing alert in the center of his stall, ears forward in greeting. His recognition of Elena was immediate and unambiguous, a soft nickering, a step toward the stall door. He looked stronger already, his posture more confident, his eyes clearer and more focused than they had been in the darkness of his former prison. Dr. Reeves entered a moment later, her movements deliberately measured and calm. She stopped several feet from the stall, allowing Ember to observe her from a safe distance. "Beautiful conformation," she noted quietly. "Despite everything, you can see his quality." Ember regarded the newcomer with visible caution, ears flicking back and forth, nostrils flared to catch her scent. But he didn't retreat to the back of the stall or show signs of panic, which Elena took as a positive sign. "Let's take this slowly," Dr. Reeves advised. "I'll just stand here for a few minutes. Let him get used to my presence before we try anything more invasive." She remained still, occasionally speaking in low tones, more to accustom Ember to her voice than to communicate with Elena. After about 5 minutes, she slowly approached the stall door, extending her hand palm up against the bars, mirroring the non-threatening gesture Elena had used in their early interactions. Ember watched warily, but with obvious curiosity. After a moment's hesitation, he took a tentative step forward, then another, until he was close enough to stretch his neck and sniff the veterinarian's hand. His caution was evident, but so was his growing confidence in new situations. "Good response," Dr. Reeves murmured. "He's showing appropriate wariness without paralyzing fear. That's promising." She spent the next 15 minutes simply being present, occasionally offering a small treat, gradually building Ember's comfort with her proximity. Only when he began to relax, his head lowering, his eyes softening, did she signal to Elena that they could proceed with the examination. "I'll enter first," Elena said. "He's still most comfortable with me nearby during new experiences." Inside the stall, Elena positioned herself at Ember's shoulder, one hand resting lightly on his neck while Dr. Reeves began her assessment. The veterinarian worked methodically, narrating her actions in a calm, steady voice. "I'm just going to check your eyes now, young man. Good boy, that's it. Now your ears. Ember tensed when she first touched him, but didn't pull away. His trust in Elena seemed to extend provisionally to this new human who moved with similar deliberateness and spoke with similar gentleness. The examination revealed both concerns and causes for hope. Ember's body condition scored a 3 out of 9, significantly undernourished but not critically emaciated. His coat showed signs of nutritional deficiencies, dull and rough where it should be sleek. His hooves, never properly trimmed, would require corrective farrier work. Most concerning were his legs, showing slight conformational abnormalities consistent with confinement during critical growth periods. His muscle development is significantly delayed, Dr. Reeves explained as she palpated Ember's hindquarters. That's expected, given his lack of movement and exercise, but it's something we'll need to address very carefully. Too much too soon could cause injury. When she examined his eyes, however, her expression brightened slightly. Pupillary response is normal, which is remarkable considering the extended darkness. No obvious damage to the retina or optic nerve that I can detect. His vision appears intact, though he may always be somewhat light-sensitive. The most positive finding came during her assessment of his cognitive responses. She tested his reactions to various stimuli, sudden movements, unexpected sounds, visual tracking exercises, and found him remarkably adaptive for an animal with his history. His neurological responses are surprisingly typical, she noted with cautious optimism. He startles appropriately, but recovers quickly. He's processing new information efficiently. Whatever else his confinement did, it doesn't seem to have caused significant cognitive impairment. By the end of the hour-long examination, Ember was showing signs of stress, increased respiration, restless shifting, but had tolerated the entire process without extreme fear responses. Dr. Reeves administered only the most essential vaccinations, deciding to space out the remainder over several visits to avoid overwhelming his system. Outside the stall, she reviewed her findings with Elena, while Morgan took over keeping Ember company, offering quiet reassurance after the stressful examination. He's in better shape than I expected given his history, Dr. Reeves admitted. The malnutrition, muscle weakness, and developmental issues in his legs are our primary physical concerns, but they're all addressable with proper nutrition and a carefully structured exercise program. Elena felt a wave of relief. So there's no permanent damage. The veterinarian's expression turned cautious. Physically, he has a good prognosis for significant improvement, though those legs may always show some abnormality. But Elena, she added, her tone growing more serious, the psychological impact of his early experience, that's harder to predict. Right now, he's showing remarkable resilience, but trauma often manifests in unexpected ways, especially when triggered by stress or change. She handed Elena a detailed treatment plan, specialized feed formulations, supplement protocols, and the beginnings of a rehabilitation schedule designed to build strength without causing injury. We'll start with just 10 minutes of free movement in the attached paddock, twice daily. No forced exercise yet, just the opportunity to move naturally in a safe space. We'll reassess weekly and adjust as he gains strength. As Dr. Reeves packed her equipment, she offered one final observation. There's something special about this one, Elena. I've seen hundreds of rescue cases, and the ones with his history usually take months to show the level of adaptability he's demonstrating in days. Don't rush it, but don't underestimate him either. After the veterinarian left, Elena and Morgan implemented the first phase of Ember's treatment plan immediately. The specialized feed blend, rich in essential nutrients but designed to introduce calories gradually to avoid digestive shock, was prepared and offered in small, frequent meals. The supplements, primarily vitamin E, selenium and omega-3 fatty acids to support neurological function and muscle development, were carefully mixed into his feed. The most significant moment came that afternoon when they opened the Dutch door, connecting Ember's stall to the small, securely fenced paddock beyond. This controlled introduction to open space represented a critical step in his rehabilitation, offering freedom of movement without the overwhelming exposure of larger pastures. Elena stood back, giving Ember space to make his own decision about venturing outside. Morgan positioned himself near the far fence, silent and still, a reassuring presence, but not an intrusive one. At first, Ember merely approached the open doorway, head high, nostrils flared, taking in the sense of grass, earth, and open air. He balanced on the threshold for nearly 5 minutes, one hoof lifting occasionally as if to step out, then retreating in uncertainty. "No rush," Elena murmured. "All your choice." When Ember finally stepped fully into the paddock, the transformation was immediate and breathtaking. His head rose higher, his tail lifted slightly, and his stride, though still tentative, carried a hint of the natural grace his species was known for. He took several careful steps, testing the unfamiliar give of natural ground beneath his hooves, then stopped to process this new sensation. What happened next brought tears to Elena's eyes. Without warning or apparent stimulus, Ember took several quick steps forward, gave a small, experimental buck, awkward and uncoordinated but unmistakable, then broke into a choppy trot across the paddock. It lasted only seconds before he returned. To a walk, clearly exhausted by even this brief exertion, but in that moment, Elena glimpsed the horse he could become, spirited, athletic, free. "Did you see that?" she whispered to Morgan, who had moved to stand beside her. He nodded, his usual stoicism softened by a rare smile. "Mustang blood remembers freedom, even when the body doesn't know it yet." They limited this first outdoor session to exactly 10 minutes, as Dr. Reeves had instructed, even though Ember seemed reluctant to return to his stall. Overexertion at this stage could damage muscles weakened by months of disuse, setting back his physical recovery significantly. "More tomorrow," Elena promised, as she led him back inside with gentle guidance. "A little more each day." That evening, after completing the sanctuary's remaining chores and caring for the other rescue horses, Elena returned to Ember's stall with her notebook. She settled on a small stool in the corner, recording the day's observations, his responses to the veterinary examination, and his reactions to his first experience in the paddock. These detailed notes would track his progress and inform adjustments to his rehabilitation plan. As she wrote, Ember moved to stand near her, not demanding attention, but simply choosing proximity. Occasionally he would lower his head, exhaling softly against her arm or shoulder, small, deliberate connections that spoke volumes about his developing trust. "You're going to be magnificent," she told him quietly, reaching up to stroke his neck. "Not just healed, but magnificent." The next 3 days established a steady rhythm of care and carefully structured freedoms. Dr. Reeves's treatment plan was followed meticulously. The specialized nutrition, the gradually increasing time in the paddock, the introduction of gentle, sensory stimulation to help him process the world beyond darkness. Morgan had crafted simple enrichment devices, a hanging ball with apple scent that encouraged natural stretching movements, different textured surfaces that provided tactile stimulation, wind chimes that introduced varied sounds at a safe distance. Each was introduced slowly, allowing Ember to investigate at his own pace without overwhelming his developing senses. By the 4th day at the sanctuary, Ember's physical improvement was already visible. His coat had begun to show hints of natural shine, his eyes were brighter and more engaged, and his movements in the paddock were becoming more coordinated with each session. Most telling was his increasing curiosity, his willingness to approach and investigate new objects, his attentiveness to the world beyond his enclosure. The sanctuary's daily routine provided structure and predictability that seemed to comfort him. Morning feed at 7, first paddock time at 10, midday feed at noon, grooming at 2, second paddock time at 4, evening feed at 6, final check at 8. Between these fixed points, Eleanor, Morgan, and their small team of experienced volunteers took turns simply being present near his stall, reading aloud, playing soft music, or working quietly on other tasks within his line of sight. The constant, non-threatening human presence helped normalize social interaction without demanding it. On the morning of the 5th day, Eleanor arrived at the sanctuary to find Morgan waiting for her at the main gate, his expression unusually grave. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately, reading the tension in his posture. "We have a situation," he replied, his voice low. "The previous owner's family. They're claiming Ember was mistakenly taken, that he was just being temporarily housed in that barn while they prepared better accommodations. They've filed a formal complaint and are demanding his return." Elena's blood ran cold. "That's absurd. He was severely neglected. The conditions were documented by animal control, by the sheriff's department, by Dr. Reeves." "I know," Morgan interrupted gently. "But they're claiming they were in the process of improving his situation when he was seized without proper notification. They've hired an attorney." "On what grounds could they possibly—" "Ownership papers," Morgan explained grimly. "Apparently, they have documentation showing they purchased the mare at auction before she foaled. Technically, they own any offspring." Elena's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Ownership doesn't grant the right to neglect or abuse. We have evidence of severe neglect. And they have a narrative about temporary circumstances and intentions to improve conditions," Morgan countered. "It's not clear-cut in legal terms. The sheriff called this morning to give us a heads up. The family has scheduled a visit to inspect the animal's current condition. They're coming at noon with their attorney." Elena's mind raced, calculating possibilities, risks, options. "They can't just take him," she said finally. "There's a process. We have temporary custody, while the neglect case is investigated." "True," Morgan acknowledged, "but this visit complicates things. They're building a case, Elena, and they're connected. The husband's brother is apparently on the county council. We need to be strategic about this. The implications were devastating. After everything Ember had endured, after the remarkable progress of the past week, the idea of him returning to the people who had kept him in darkness was unthinkable. Yet legal battles over rescued animals were increasingly common, especially when the animals in question had potential value. And a young Mustang, despite his developmental issues, could represent significant value to the right buyer. "We need to call our attorney," Elena decided. "And Dr. Reeves, I want her present for this visit, with complete documentation of his condition upon arrival. And we need to contact the original responding officers who documented the conditions at the property." Morgan nodded, already pulling out his phone. "I'll handle the calls. You stay with Ember. Keep his routine as normal as possible." As Morgan walked away to make the necessary arrangements, Elena stood frozen, a cold knot of dread forming in her stomach. She had faced custody challenges before in her rescue work, angry owners, disputed seizures, legal threats, but never for an animal as vulnerable and seemingly irreplaceable as Ember. The thought of him returning to darkness, to neglect, to people who saw him as property rather than a living being deserving of care and respect was physically painful. With deliberate effort, she pushed the fear aside and walked toward the rehabilitation barn. Ember needed consistency now more than ever. He would sense any anxiety or distress she carried, and his newly established sense of security was still too fragile to withstand emotional turbulence from his primary caregiver. When she entered his stall, Ember greeted her with his now customary soft nickering, moving to meet her with growing confidence. His eyes were bright, his movements more fluid than they had been just days ago. Looking at him now, it was hard to imagine the trembling, skeletal creature she had found in that dark barn less than a week earlier. "Morning, beautiful boy," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Ready for breakfast?" She went through their morning routine with meticulous attention to normalcy. The same words, the same gestures, the same quiet presence that had become his safety and security. As she prepared his feed with the prescribed supplements, she found herself memorizing details: the unique whirl of hair between his eyes, the exact shade of his chestnut coat in the morning light, the particular way he lowered his head when she approached. "Nothing changes," she promised him softly, stroking his neck as he ate. "I won't let anything change." But as the morning progressed and noon approached, the sanctuary buzzed with unusual activity. The attorney arrived first, followed by Dr. Reeves with her complete medical files. 2 volunteers stationed themselves strategically at the main entrance, prepared to document the arrival of the visitors with photographs and video. Standard procedure for contested custody cases, but unsettling nonetheless. At 11:50, Elena was with Ember in the paddock for his morning exercise session, when Morgan appeared at the fence. "They're here," he said quietly. 3 of them, the husband, wife, and their attorney. "The sheriff sent a deputy to observe, which is good for us. Dr. Reeves is meeting them at the main office to review the medical documentation before they come to see Ember." Elena nodded, her throat tight. "I'll bring him in. I want him in his stall, in familiar surroundings before they arrive." As she led Ember back inside, she felt a surge of protective determination so intense it nearly took her breath away. This young horse, who had endured darkness and emerged still reaching for connection, still capable of trust despite having every reason to fear humans, he deserved more than to be a pawn in a legal battle over property rights. "Stay strong," she whispered, as much to herself as to Ember. "We're just getting started." The visitors arrived at Ember's stall, preceded by the sound of unfamiliar voices. A man's deep, authoritative tone, a woman's higher, more agitated pitch, and the measured cadence of someone clearly accustomed to legal proceedings. Eleanor positioned herself beside Ember, one hand resting lightly on his neck, providing steady reassurance through touch. Morgan stood at the stall entrance, his body language deliberately casual, but his eyes watchful and assessing. Dr. Reeves led the group into the barn, her professional demeanor firmly in place. "As I was explaining, the colt's condition upon arrival demonstrated severe nutritional deficiencies consistent with prolonged neglect. His blood work shows—" "We're not here for a medical lecture," the man interrupted, stepping forward into view. He was tall, heavy-set, with the ruddy complexion of someone who spent time outdoors, but the soft hands of someone who directed rather than performed physical labor. "We're here to see our property." Eleanor felt Ember tense immediately at the sound of the man's voice. The young Mustang's ears flattened, his body shifting subtly to position Elena between himself and the newcomers. The reaction was unmistakable, not just the wariness he showed with unfamiliar people, but something deeper, more visceral, recognition. The woman pushed ahead, smaller than her husband, but with the same entitled air. Her gaze swept critically over the stall, the water bucket, the specialized feed setup before landing on Ember himself. "He looks fine," she declared dismissively. "A little thin, maybe, but hardly the abused animal they're claiming. Ranch horses are often kept in barns. It's normal." Elena bit back the sharp retort that rose to her lips, maintaining her calm exterior for Ember's sake. The deputy sheriff, standing quietly at the back of the group, made a small note in his notebook. The couple's attorney, a slim man in an expensive suit that seemed out of place in a horse barn, cleared his throat. My clients, Mr. and Mrs. Hargrove, acknowledge that temporary housing conditions for the colt were less than ideal. However, they had contracted with a builder to create appropriate stabling, which was delayed due to supply issues. The animal was receiving regular care while awaiting improved accommodations. Dr. Reeves raised an eyebrow. Regular care that resulted in a body condition score of 3 out of 9, developmental abnormalities consistent with confinement during critical growth periods and severe light deprivation. Interesting definition of care, counselor. Mr. Hargrove stepped closer to the stall, causing Ember to shift nervously. He's a horse, not a child. He was fed, he had water. This whole situation is being blown completely out of proportion. Elena continued stroking Ember's neck, keeping her voice low and even, despite her rising anger. He was kept in total darkness, Mr. Hargrove. No light, minimal human contact, inadequate nutrition. That's not subjective interpretation. It's documented. Fact. Temporary circumstances. The attorney interjected smoothly. My clients had already purchased proper lighting fixtures and were awaiting electrical work when the animal was improperly removed from their property. Morgan, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. The animal has a name. It's Ember. Mrs. Hargrove rolled her eyes. Of course you named it. Makes it harder to treat it like the livestock it actually is. Eleanor felt a surge of protective fury that she carefully contained behind a professional facade. Regardless of how you classify him, there are legal standards for animal care, standards that weren't being met. The attorney nodded as if conceding a minor point, which is why my clients are prepared to demonstrate their commitment to improved conditions. They've completed the stabling renovations and are prepared to provide documentation of purchased feed, scheduled veterinary care, and appropriate daily maintenance. The initial situation was regrettable but temporary. Throughout this exchange, Elena remained acutely aware of Ember's reactions. His body remained tense, his breathing slightly elevated, but he wasn't showing signs of panic or extreme distress. His trust in her presence seemed to be anchoring him, despite the obvious stress of the situation. Dr. Reeves stepped forward, medical file in hand. I'd like to clarify something for the record. The developmental issues I've documented aren't simply a matter of being underweight or temporarily confined. This colt's physical condition reflects chronic, extended neglect during critical growth periods. His muscular development, bone density, and neurological responses all show patterns, consistent with prolonged sensory deprivation and malnutrition. Speculation, the attorney countered immediately. You have no baseline for comparison, no documentation of his condition at birth or during early development. The mare died shortly after foaling, which could account for developmental challenges, independent of my client's care practices. The deputy, who had been observing silently, finally spoke. The conditions documented at the property speak for themselves, sir. Total darkness, inadequate ventilation, minimal bedding, waste buildup, consistent with infrequent cleaning. Whether temporary or not, those conditions constitute neglect under county regulations. Mr. Hargrove's face flushed with anger. We were dealing with unexpected circumstances. The mare wasn't supposed to die. We had to adapt. By locking a newborn, foal in a windowless shed for months, Elena couldn't keep the edge from her voice now. That's not adaptation, it's abandonment. The attorney placed a restraining hand on Mr. Hargrove's arm as the man started to respond heatedly. We're not here to debate past circumstances. We're here to establish that my clients are prepared to provide appropriate care moving forward, and that they retain legal ownership of the animal in question. Dr. Reeves closed her file with a deliberate motion. And I'm here to establish that returning this colt to his previous situation would constitute a significant risk to his physical and psychological recovery. He requires specialized rehabilitation that includes expert care, appropriate socialization, and a carefully structured environment, none of which were evident in his previous circumstances. The tension in the barn was palpable now, the competing interests clearly defined. Throughout the increasingly heated exchange, Ember had pressed closer to Elena, his body language communicating clear distress at the presence of his former owners. This reaction wasn't lost on the deputy, who made another note in his book. Mrs. Hargrove, apparently tiring of the technical discussion, suddenly turned her attention directly to Elena. "You think you're rescuing him, don't you? Playing the hero? Do you have any idea what it costs to properly raise and train a Mustang? We invested in his potential. He's an investment, not a pet." The naked calculation in her tone sent a chill through Elena. "Is that why you kept him hidden away, as an investment?" "We kept him contained because he was unhandled and potentially dangerous," Mr. Hargrove interjected. "Mustangs aren't domesticated horses. They're wild animals that require firm management." Elena glanced at Ember, who, despite his obvious anxiety, was standing quietly beside her, occasionally pressing his muzzle against her shoulder in a gesture that had become his way of seeking reassurance. "He doesn't seem particularly dangerous. To me, because you've had him, 5 days?" Mrs. Hargrove scoffed. "Hardly enough time to assess his true temperament. We've owned him since before birth." "Ownership isn't the same as relationship," Elena replied evenly. "He doesn't know you. He's showing clear stress responses to your presence that speaks volumes about your past interactions." The attorney, sensing the conversation moving in an unproductive direction, intervened smoothly. "Let's focus on the legal situation. My clients have filed for an emergency hearing to contest the seizure and establish their continuing ownership rights. Until that hearing, the animal remains in the sanctuary's temporary custody, but a ruling could change that status as early as next week." Elena felt her stomach tighten at the timeline. 1 week. 7 days to somehow prove that returning Ember to the Hargroves would endanger his welfare beyond the legal threshold required to terminate ownership rights. It was a distressingly short window. The deputy stepped forward. "Just to be clear about the process, the sanctuary has temporary protective custody during the investigation of neglect charges. The hearing will determine whether that custody becomes extended pending full resolution of those charges, or whether the animal is returned to the owners with monitoring conditions." Dr. Reeves nodded. "And I'll be submitting my complete medical assessment as evidence for that hearing, including my professional opinion regarding the risks of disrupting his current rehabilitation program." Mr. Hargrove made a dismissive gesture. "One vet's opinion. We'll have our own experts testify." The inspection continued for another 20 minutes, with the Hargroves' attorney documenting Ember's current condition, housing and care regimen, ostensibly to ensure proper treatment, but obviously to build a case for his client's petition for return. Throughout this process, Elena remained at Ember's side, a steady, calming presence amid the tension. When the visitors finally departed, with the attorney promising formal notification of the hearing date within 48 hours, Elena felt Ember's entire body relax. The young Mustang exhaled deeply, lowering his head as if physically releasing the stress of the encounter. "You did so well," she murmured, stroking his forehead. "So brave." Morgan joined her in the stall, his expression grave. "That went about as expected. They're not backing down." Elena nodded, still focused on Ember's comfort. "Did you see how he reacted to their voices before he even saw them? He remembers, Morgan. He knows exactly who they are. That reaction could be important at the hearing," Morgan observed. "If the judge sees clear distress responses to the previous owners, it strengthens our case." Dr. Reeves, who had returned after escorting the visitors out, joined the conversation. "I'll include his behavioral responses in my report. But we need more than just stress reactions. We need concrete evidence that returning him would constitute ongoing harm. Elena looked between her two colleagues, determination hardening her resolve. Then that's what we'll get. The sheriff has the original documentation of the conditions. We have your medical assessment. What else do we need? Character witnesses, Morgan suggested. People who've observed his progress here versus his condition upon arrival. The more credible voices we have testifying to the transformation, the stronger our position. And documentation of his continued improvement under proper care, Dr. Reeves added. Daily records of weight gain, behavioral milestones, physical development. The more we can demonstrate positive change in this environment, the clearer the contrast becomes with his previous situation. Eleanor nodded, already mentally composing a battle plan. We need to contact everyone who was involved in the rescue. The anonymous tipster, if they'll come forward, the neighbor who directed me to the barn, the original animal control officers. And we need our attorney to prepare for aggressive questioning. The Hargroves have resources and connections. This won't be easy. The reality of the situation settled around them like a weight. The legal system, for all its protections, still largely treated animals as property. Proving that owners were unfit required meeting a substantial burden of evidence that could be difficult to gather for neglect that occurred behind closed doors. We have one advantage, Dr. Reeves observed quietly. Ember himself. Anyone who spends even 10 minutes with him can see his intelligence, his willingness to connect despite everything he's endured. If we can get the right people to simply observe him, his responses, his progress, his clear preference for his current situation, it speaks to something beyond technical legal arguments. As the day progressed, Elena maintained Ember's routine with almost obsessive precision. The consistency was as much for her benefit as for his, a way to focus on concrete actions rather than spiraling into worry about the uncertain future. Each feeding, each grooming session, each brief period in the paddock became an opportunity to document another small improvement, another piece of evidence for the case they were building. By evening, the sanctuary's attorney had called with the official hearing date, 6 days from now, 9 a.m. at the county courthouse. The timeline was tight, but not unexpected. Cases involving livestock were typically expedited to minimize care costs and resolve ownership questions quickly. After completing Ember's evening feeding, Elena sat on the small stool in his stall, notebook open on her lap. She had been keeping detailed records since his rescue, but now those notes took on new urgency and purpose. She documented every interaction, every physical change, every behavioral response with meticulous attention to detail. Ember, perhaps, sensing her preoccupation, moved to stand beside her, his muzzle gently nudging her shoulder in what had become his signature gesture of connection. The simple act of trust, this formerly terrified colt voluntarily seeking contact, brought unexpected tears to Elena's eyes. "We're going to fight for you," she promised him softly, "with everything we have." The 6 days leading up to the hearing passed in a blur of preparation, documentation, and strategic planning. Dr. Reeves visited daily, tracking Ember's physical improvements with scientific precision, weight gain measured to the ounce, muscle development photographed and assessed, blood values gradually trending toward normal ranges. The sanctuary's attorney interviewed potential witnesses, gathered affidavits, and prepared arguments based on both the letter and spirit of animal welfare laws. Most significantly, Ember himself continued to flourish under consistent care and gentle handling. His coat began to develop a healthy shine, his movements became more coordinated, and his confidence grew visibly with each passing day. The trust he showed toward Elena expanded cautiously to include Morgan and several of the experienced sanctuary volunteers. Not the same deep connection, but a willingness to accept their presence and handling without fear. On the afternoon before the hearing, Elena arranged for something special, a supervised introduction to another horse. Social interaction with his own species was a critical component of normal equine development that Ember had been entirely denied. Dr. Reeves had suggested beginning this process with a particularly calm, maternal older mare named Willow, who had helped rehabilitate several traumatized youngsters over the years. The introduction took place in adjacent paddocks, allowing visual and limited physical contact across a fence line without the pressure of sharing space. Elena led Ember into his paddock first, giving him time to settle before Morgan brought Willow to the adjoining enclosure. Ember's reaction to seeing another horse for the first time in his conscious memory was nothing short of magical. His entire body language transformed. Head high, ears pricked forward in intense interest, nostrils flared to capture this new, fascinating scent. He approached the fence with cautious excitement, stretching his neck to observe the placid mare, who regarded him with gentle curiosity in return. When Willow nickered softly in greeting, Ember froze, clearly processing this new form of communication. Then, in a moment that Elena would later describe as breakthrough, he responded with his own tentative vocalization. Not a proper nicker yet, but a clear attempt to reply in kind. "He's speaking horse," Morgan observed quietly from where he stood, monitoring the interaction. Language he never had a chance to learn. Elena nodded, too moved to speak. The interaction continued for 20 carefully supervised minutes. Willow demonstrating perfect equine social cues, Ember responding with increasing confidence and appropriate behaviors he somehow instinctively knew, despite his isolation. When they finally led the horses back to their respective stalls, Ember carried himself differently, more animated, more connected to his inherent nature. That evening, as Eleanor completed her final notes before the hearing, she added a detailed description of the social interaction, emphasizing the dramatic positive impact on Ember's demeanor and confidence. This, perhaps more than any technical medical evidence, illustrated what was truly at stake, not just an animal's physical condition, but his fundamental right to express his natural being, to become the horse he was meant to be, rather than the shadow creature the darkness had shaped. The morning of the hearing arrived clear and cool. Elena had barely slept, her mind racing with arguments, counter-arguments, and contingency plans. She arrived at the sanctuary before dawn, needing to center herself with Ember before facing the legal battle ahead. He greeted her with his now customary soft nickering, moving to the stall door with easy familiarity. In just 11 days, he had transformed from a terrified, skeletal creature huddled in darkness to a young horse, beginning to embody the spirit and presence of his wild heritage. The change was remarkable, visible in every aspect of his being: his improved physical condition, his increasingly confident movements, his willingness to engage and connect. Elena spent an hour with him, going through their morning routine with deliberate attention to each moment, each interaction. Whatever happened in the courtroom today, she wanted to carry this image of Ember with her, not as he had been found, but as he was becoming. "Today determines what happens next," she told him softly, stroking his neck, "but not who you are. That's already decided. You're already becoming yourself, and nothing can take that away." Morgan arrived as she was finishing Ember's morning care, dressed in uncharacteristically formal attire for the hearing. "The team's all set," he reported. "Dr. Reeves will meet us at the courthouse with the complete medical file. The sheriff is bringing the original documentation from the property. 3 volunteers will testify about his progress here. Our attorney says we've built the strongest case possible under the circumstances." Elena nodded, taking one last look at Ember before closing his stall door. "It has to be enough, Morgan. It has to be." The county courthouse stood in the center of town, an imposing brick building that had witnessed generations of local justice. Inside, the hearing room was smaller than Elena had imagined, a conference-style space rather than a formal courtroom, with a long table where the judge would sit and rows of chairs for the participants and limited observers. The Hargroves were already present when Elena's group arrived, seated near the front with their attorney and two unfamiliar men Elena assumed were their expert witnesses. Mrs. Hargrove shot her a cold glare, while Mr. Hargrove studiously avoided eye contact, consulting paperwork with exaggerated focus. Dr. Reeves joined them moments later, professional and composed in a tailored suit that lent additional authority to her expertise. "Ready?" she asked quietly. Elena nodded, though her stomach was twisted with anxiety. "As ready as we can be." Their attorney, Ms. Diaz, a woman known for her passionate advocacy in animal welfare cases, gathered them for a final briefing. "Remember, this is about evidence, not emotion," she cautioned. "Stick to facts, observations, and professional assessments. The judge needs legal grounds for a custody decision, not just good intentions." The bailiff called the room to order. As Judge Harris entered, a stern-looking woman in her 60s, with steel-grey hair and piercing eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they fell upon. She reviewed the case file briefly before addressing the room. "This is a hearing to determine temporary custody of the equine identified as Ember, a Mustang colt approximately 4 months of age, pending resolution of animal neglect charges against the registered owners, Robert and Catherine Hargrove. I'll hear evidence from both parties, then make a determination based on the best interest of the animal and the legal standings involved." She nodded to the Hargroves' attorney. "You may begin." As the opposing counsel rose to make his opening statement, Elena took a deep breath, steadying herself for the battle ahead. In her mind's eye, she held the image of Ember as she'd left him this morning, head high, eyes bright, the darkness behind him and possibility ahead. Whatever happened in this room today, that transformation was real. That truth was worth fighting. For the Hargroves' attorney stood with practiced confidence, his voice measured and reasonable as he presented their case. "Your Honor, this matter is fundamentally about property rights and the overreach of well-meaning but unauthorized intervention. My clients purchased a pregnant mare at auction last winter, with all proper documentation and transfer of ownership. When that mare gave birth and subsequently died from complications, my clients became the legal owners of her foal." He gestured toward Elena and the sanctuary representatives with a slight dismissive motion. "No one disputes this ownership. What's being disputed is whether temporary housing conditions that were actively being improved, justified the seizure of valuable livestock without due process." Judge Harris made a note, her expression neutral. "And regarding the conditions documented by animal control, regrettable but temporary," the attorney replied smoothly. "The colt's original housing was meant as a short-term solution following the unexpected death of the mare. My clients had already contracted for appropriate stabling construction, purchased proper feeding equipment, and scheduled veterinary care. We have documentation of all these arrangements." He slid several folders across the table toward the judge, receipts, contracts, even a brochure from a custom stable builder with handwritten notes about dimensions and features. "The timing was unfortunate," he continued. "Had animal control arrived even 2 weeks later, they would have found a very different situation. Instead, they removed a valuable animal based on a snapshot view of conditions that were already being addressed." Elena felt her jaw tighten as she listened to this carefully constructed narrative. The receipts and contracts were likely real, but the timing was suspiciously convenient, probably initiated after the first warning from animal control, then backdated to create the appearance of proactive care. The attorney shifted his approach, his tone becoming more sympathetic. My clients are not professional horse breeders. They purchased the mare as their first venture into what they hoped would be a small-scale breeding operation. They were unprepared for the complications that followed and made mistakes in their response. Mistakes they acknowledge and have already taken concrete steps to correct. He gestured toward the back of the room, where an older man in worn jeans and a plaid shirt sat quietly. They've hired Mr. James Thornton, a respected local horse trainer with 30 years of experience, to oversee the colt's care moving forward. They've completed construction of appropriate stabling, with proper light, ventilation and space. They've purchased high-quality feed formulated specifically for developing foals. Judge Harris looked toward the man. Mr. Thornton, you're willing to testify that you've been retained by the Hargroves for this purpose. The trainer stood, hat in hands. Yes, Your Honor. I inspected their new facilities last week. They're adequate, good even. I've agreed to visit 3 times weekly to oversee the colt's development and training. Elena exchanged a glance with their attorney, Ms. Diaz. This was an unexpected complication. The Hargroves had found a respected local horseman to lend credibility to their claims of improvement. Ms. Diaz made a quick note, probably intending to question the trainer's actual knowledge of the colt's previous conditions. The Hargroves' attorney continued, now displaying photographs of a newly constructed stable, clean, well-lit, with fresh bedding and modern equipment. These remedial actions demonstrate my client's commitment to proper care. They made mistakes out of inexperience, not malice or deliberate neglect. They've invested significantly in correcting those mistakes. He turned toward the judge, his expression earnest. Is it fair to permanently deprive them of their property they've now spent thousands of dollars to properly accommodate, based on temporary conditions that no longer exist? Is that the precedent this court wishes to set for animal owners in this county? It was a clever angle, Elena had to admit. Framing the case as an issue of property rights and government overreach rather than animal welfare would resonate with many rural judges who often came from agricultural backgrounds where livestock was viewed primarily as an economic asset. The attorney concluded with a final appeal to pragmatism. The sanctuary has done admirable work providing temporary care, but the colt's permanent place is with his legal owners, who have demonstrated both the means and commitment to proper maintenance. We ask that he be returned to them immediately, with whatever reasonable monitoring conditions the court deems appropriate. Judge Harris nodded without expression. Thank you, Counselor. Ms. Diaz, please present your response. Eleanor's attorney rose with calm professionalism that belied the stakes involved. Your Honor, this case is not fundamentally about property rights, but about welfare and the legal standards of care that all animal owners must meet. Standards that exist precisely because animals, unlike other property, are living beings capable of suffering. She opened her own folder, removing photographs taken the day of Ember's rescue. These images document conditions that go far beyond regrettable but temporary. They show systematic extended neglect that caused demonstrable physical and psychological harm. The photographs were difficult to view. The dark, filthy stall, Ember's skeletal body, his terrified posture in the corner, the absence of proper food or clean water. Judge Harris examined them with a slight furrowing of her brow. Dr. Lillian Reeves, one of the most respected equine veterinarians in the state, has provided a comprehensive assessment of the colt's condition upon rescue. Ms. Diaz continued, sliding the medical report across the table. Her findings indicate prolonged malnutrition, muscle atrophy consistent with extended confinement, and developmental abnormalities that will have lifelong consequences. Dr. Reeves was called to testify next. Presenting her findings with clinical precision, she explained how Ember's blood work showed long-term nutritional deficiencies, how his bone density was compromised by lack of movement and vitamin D, how His muscular development had been profoundly delayed by confinement during critical growth periods. In my professional opinion, she concluded, the conditions documented at the Hargrove property constitute severe neglect that has caused permanent developmental impairment. While some aspects can improve with proper rehabilitation, others, particularly certain conformational issues in his legs, represent irreversible damage. The Hargrove's attorney immediately challenged this assessment. Doctor, isn't it true that many foals experience developmental challenges, particularly when the mare dies shortly after birth? How can you attribute these issues specifically to my client's care rather than to complications from the mare's death? Dr. Reeves remained unruffled. The specific pattern of abnormalities observed in this colt is consistent with sensory deprivation and confinement, not merely with orphan status. Many orphan foals develop normally when provided appropriate nutrition, exercise, and environmental stimulation. This colt received none of those things for a critical period of approximately 3 months. The questioning continued, with the opposing attorney attempting to characterize the medical assessment as speculative rather than definitive. Dr. Reeves held firm, pointing to specific measurements, comparisons with established developmental norms, and photographic documentation that supported her conclusions. When Elena was called to testify, she focused on Ember's behavioral indicators rather than technical medical evidence. She described his extreme fear responses upon rescue, his inability to process normal sensory input, his gradual progress under appropriate care, and, most tellingly, his clear stress reactions when confronted with his former owners. When the Hargroves visited the sanctuary, Ember displayed immediate and pronounced fear responses to their voices, even before seeing them, she explained. His body language, respiratory rate, and positioning all indicated recognition and distress. These weren't the reactions of an animal simply responding to strangers. These were trauma responses to specific individuals associated with previous suffering. The cross-examination was aggressive, attempting to portray Elena as an emotional activist rather than a qualified professional. The attorney questioned her formal education, her potential financial interest in retaining valuable rescued animals, even her psychological ability to distinguish between actual animal responses and projected interpretations. Elena maintained her composure, countering with her 15 years of documented experience in equine rehabilitation, her certification in equine behavior assessment, and the consistent validation of her observational findings by veterinary professionals. Morgan testified next, providing detailed documentation of Ember's daily care regimen at the sanctuary and the measurable improvements in his condition. His practical, matter-of-fact delivery provided an effective complement to the more technical testimony, offering concrete examples of how proper care was addressing the deficits caused by neglect. The sheriff's deputy who had accompanied the original animal control officer provided particularly damning testimony about the conditions found at the Hargrove property. In my 12 years of service, it's among the worst cases of equine neglect I've encountered that didn't involve starvation death, he stated bluntly. The stall had clearly not been cleaned in weeks. There was no light source whatsoever. The water trough contained algae consistent with long-term stagnation. When Mr. Thornton, the horse trainer hired by the Hargroves, took the stand, Ms. Diaz's questioning revealed important limitations in his engagement. So you've never actually met or assessed the colt in question, she clarified. No, ma'am, he admitted. I've only evaluated the new facilities and discussed general training approaches with the Hargroves. And were you fully informed about the colt's developmental issues resulting from his previous confinement? The trainer shifted uncomfortably. I was told he needed some special handling. The specifics weren't really discussed. So you haven't developed a rehabilitation plan specifically tailored to his unique medical and psychological needs. Not specifically, no. I'd assess that once he was returned. This exchange subtly undermined the Hargroves' claim of comprehensive remedial action, suggesting their preparations were more about creating the appearance of proper care than actually understanding and addressing Ember's specific requirements. As the testimony continued, Elena watched Judge Harris closely, trying to gauge her reactions. The judge maintained a professional neutrality throughout the proceedings, asking pointed questions of both sides that revealed neither bias nor inclination. Her focus seemed particularly keen when reviewing the medical evidence and the documented conditions at rescue, which Elena took as a hopeful sign. The final witness was something of a surprise, a neighboring property owner who had observed the Hargroves' treatment of their animals over the previous year. He described multiple instances of neglect, not just of Ember, but of other livestock, patterns of purchasing animals and then losing interest when they proved more demanding than expected, and conversations in which the Hargroves had discussed horses primarily as financial investments rather than living beings requiring care. They were always talking about how much they could sell the foal for once it was weaned, he testified, but I never once saw them actually handling it or caring for it properly. That barn was closed up tight from the day the mare died. I should have reported it sooner, and that's on me. In closing arguments, the Hargroves' attorney returned to the property rights framework, emphasizing the investments his clients had made in remediation and their legal ownership of the colt. They've acknowledged mistakes, addressed the conditions that concerned animal control, and secured professional guidance moving forward. The standard for permanent removal of livestock from its legal owners must be extraordinarily high, a standard simply not met in this case. Ms. Diaz's closing focused on the severity and duration of the neglect, the documented physical and psychological harm, and Ember's demonstrated progress in appropriate care. This isn't about punishment or property rights, she argued. It's about ensuring this young animal's welfare going forward. The developmental damage already caused cannot be undone, but returning him to the environment and individuals associated with that trauma creates an unacceptable risk of additional harm. Judge Harris reviewed her notes carefully before announcing her decision. This case presents a challenging balance between property rights and animal welfare standards, both of which are protected under our laws. The question before me is not whether the Hargroves have legal ownership, they clearly do, but whether the demonstrated neglect and its consequences justify continued protective custody. She turned her attention to the Hargroves. The conditions documented at your property fell far below acceptable standards of care, regardless of your intentions or explanations. The evidence indicates not a temporary lapse, but a prolonged pattern of serious neglect that caused measurable harm. Elena felt a surge of hope at these words, though she maintained her professional exterior. However, the judge continued, I must also consider your remedial actions and the legal threshold for permanent removal of livestock from its owners. That threshold requires clear evidence that returning the animal would pose an immediate and continuing threat to its welfare, despite the improvements made. The courtroom was utterly silent, the tension palpable as everyone awaited the final determination. Based on the evidence presented, I find that the colt's unique developmental needs resulting from the documented neglect require specialized care that has not been adequately addressed by the owner's remedial actions. The veterinary testimony regarding his specific medical and psychological requirements was particularly persuasive in this regard. Judge Harris straightened her papers decisively. Therefore, I'm ordering extended protective custody with Whispering Wind Sanctuary for a period of 90 days, during which the Hargroves must complete the following conditions if they wish to petition for return. completion of an accredited course in equine care and management, development of a specific rehabilitation plan approved by a qualified equine veterinarian, and supervised visitation to demonstrate appropriate handling techniques. She fixed the Hargroves with a stern expression. To be perfectly clear, this is not a permanent termination of ownership rights, but an extension of protective custody based on the specific rehabilitation needs documented by medical professionals. If these conditions are met satisfactorily within the 90-day period, I will reconsider the custody arrangement. Elena exhaled slowly, processing the decision. Not a complete victory, but a significant one. 3 more months of protected rehabilitation for Ember, with substantial hurdles for the Hargroves to clear before any reconsideration. Given their apparent motivation of financial investment rather than genuine care, Elena suspected they might abandon their claim rather than invest the time and effort required by the judge's conditions. As the hearing concluded and the participants began to disperse, Mr. Hargrove approached Elena with unexpected directness, his wife remaining coldly distant by the door. "This isn't over," he stated flatly. "That colt is worth money, good money once he's grown and trained. You think we don't know why you're so interested in him? Mustang bloodlines are selling for premium prices these days." Elena met his gaze steadily. "I'm interested in him because he deserves care and respect as a living being, not a financial asset. If you actually provided that care, we wouldn't be here." 3 months, he replied, ignoring her response. "Then we'll be back, with every requirement checked off your little list. Count on it." As he turned to leave, Elena wondered if he truly understood the depth of commitment the judge's conditions actually required. Not just paperwork and facilities, but demonstrated knowledge and handling skills that would be carefully evaluated. The next 3 months would tell whether the Hargroves' interest in Ember was strong enough to motivate genuine change or merely financial calculation. Outside the courthouse, Eleanor found a quiet moment alone before rejoining her team. The morning's tension had left her drained but resolute. 3 months wasn't permanent protection, but it was a substantial window. Time for Ember to continue healing, growing stronger, and establishing the foundations of trust that would shape his future. Morgan found her there, his usually stoic expression softened with relief. "Good result," he said simply. "Judge Harris has a reputation for fairness. If they don't meet those conditions completely, she won't hesitate to extend custody again." Elena nodded. "They won't meet them. Not really. They might go through the motions, but actually learning proper equine care, developing genuine handling skills. I saw their faces when the judge listed the requirements. They're calculating whether he's worth the investment, not how to become better caretakers." "Then we document everything over the next 90 days, Morgan replied practically. "Every improvement, every milestone, every advance in his rehabilitation. We build an irrefutable case for his specialized needs." Elena's phone chimed with a message from the sanctuary's volunteer coordinator. "How did it go?" "Ember's been unusually restless all morning, almost like he knows something important is happening." The simple text brought unexpected emotion to Elena's throat. The reminder that beyond all the legal arguments and technical terminology, this case was about a young, sentient being whose future hung in the balance. A being who, despite everything he'd endured, still possessed the capacity for connection, for trust, for joy. "Let's go home," she said to Morgan, suddenly eager to return to the sanctuary, to continue the work that truly mattered. "We've got 90 days to show exactly what Ember can become with proper care. Let's make every one of them count." The drive back to Whispering Winds seemed shorter than usual, Elena's mind already shifting from legal concerns to practical rehabilitation plans. The judge's decision had created a defined timeline, adding urgency to Ember's development program. Every improvement, every new skill, Every positive behavioral change would now serve dual purposes, supporting his recovery and strengthening the case for his permanent placement at the sanctuary. In the warm glow of the barn's evening lights, with Ember's soft breathing providing a gentle backdrop to her thoughts, Elena began planning the journey ahead, not just the rehabilitation program that would strengthen his body and mind, but the documentation that would secure his future, because somewhere in those 90 days lay the key to freedom, not just from darkness, but from the uncertainty that still shadowed his path. The next morning would begin that journey in earnest, with new milestones to reach, new connections to forge, and new dimensions of trust to explore. For now, though, it was enough to know that for at least 90 precious days, Ember would continue to heal in the light. 1 year later, Elena stood at the fence of the sanctuary's largest pasture, watching as Ember galloped across the open field. His chestnut coat gleamed in the sunlight, muscles rippling beneath his skin with each powerful stride. At his side ran Willow, the mare who had become his closest companion and teacher. Behind them, 2 other rescued horses followed, part of the small herd that had become Ember's family. The 90 days had stretched into 6 months, then a year. The Hargroves had attended 1 required class, filed some paperwork, then gradually stopped responding to court notices. Their final communication had been terse and revealing. Not worth the hassle, keep the horse. Their attorney had formalized the surrender of ownership, and the court had granted the sanctuary permanent custody. Ember was finally, officially, home. Magnificent, isn't he? Dr. Reeves commented, joining Elena at the fence. Her regular visits had become less frequent as Ember's health stabilized, but she remained invested in his progress. Hard to believe he's the same colt we found in that dark barn, Elena replied, smiling as Ember executed a playful buck before racing back toward them. The developmental issues in his legs had improved beyond expectation, though a slight irregularity in his gait would always remain, a permanent reminder of his early confinement. But in every other way, he had flourished beyond anyone's most optimistic predictions. At 15 months old, he stood tall and proud, his eyes clear and confident, his demeanor balancing the natural caution of his wild heritage with the trust he had learned through consistent care and respect. He approached the fence now, blowing softly through his nostrils in greeting. "Hello, handsome," Elena said, reaching out to stroke his forehead where the small white blaze had developed into a distinctive star-shaped marking, showing off for visitors again. Morgan joined them, clipboard in hand. "The school group will be here in 20 minutes. Ember's part of the presentation on rehabilitation success stories." Elena nodded, feeling a surge of pride. Ember's journey had become an educational tool, helping children understand animal welfare and the responsibilities of proper care. His story had touched hundreds already, from local school groups to university veterinary students studying rehabilitation techniques. "He belongs in the spotlight," she said. "After everything, he deserves to be seen." As Ember trotted back to join his herd, head high and steps confident, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From darkness to light, from isolation to connection, from fear to trust. It hadn't been easy or straightforward, but each step, each small victory, each setback overcome, had created something beautiful. Some horses are born into ideal circumstances, with open fields and loving care from their first breath. Others, like Ember, must fight through darkness to find their place in the sun. But his story proved something powerful, that even when the world fails an innocent creature, resilience and the right kind of help can write a new ending. If this story moved you, remember, there are thousands of animals like Ember still waiting for someone to open their door, to see their potential beyond their current circumstances. Courage and compassion can transform lives, both theirs and yours. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of remarkable rescues and second chances. Leave a comment about how Ember's journey touched you, and share this video with someone who believes that light can always find a way through darkness. Because sometimes the most inspiring transformations come from the darkest beginnings. And sometimes a single act of kindness can change everything.